before the Israeli ground invasion started, there was a meeting with UNRWA and other UN and non-UN NGOs to create a humanitarian zone. UNRWA said no.
The UN agencies have blood on their hands by refusing to cooperate, evacuate civilians to safety, 100%.
Definitely, but we should have had a press conference where we should have read the protocol of that meeting. We should have said, we just met with UN officials. Present were UNRWA, UNICEF, World Health Organization, etc., etc., etc. We asked these guys to help, to work together and to build a humanitarian zone, but they refused.
And they're insisting on keeping these civilians in Hamas strongholds, in places where they can be used not only as human shields, but as human sacrifices.
Yes.
Shalom and welcome to State of a Nation. I'm Eylon Levy. Israel is fighting an information war, or rather, Israel should be fighting an information war. Because since October 7th, Iran, its proxy armies, and their useful idiots around the world have been waging a psyops campaign against Israel, spreading lies about Israel to poison global public opinion against it and persuade Western countries to abandon their chief ally in the Middle East. That's what's at stake in the battle for the narrative. But Israel is losing that information war, and sometimes it seems it's not even fighting it. Today I want to take you behind the scenes of what it means to be an official Israeli spokesman fighting that information war for Israel. Jonathan Conricus is one of my heroes of this war. A former IDF international spokesman, he was called back into reserves after October 7th and gave hundreds of TV interviews. Born in Jerusalem to a Swedish father and an Israeli mother, he spent his formative years in Sweden before serving in the IDF for 24 years in roles that took him to the heart of the diplomatic and media wars for Israel's survival. He now continues giving interviews about Israel, educating the world as a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, FDD. If there's anyone who knows what Israel has to do to fight the information war and to improve the fight against Iran, which stands behind the proxy armies surrounding us on 7 fronts, it's Lieutenant Colonel in Reserves Jonathan Conricus. Welcome to State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
Eylon. What happens when the 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this?
Where does this go?
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, welcome to State of a Nation.
Shalom Eylon, thank you.
Did you know that's how we say Lieutenant Colonel in British English? Lieutenant?
Lieutenant, you and the Australians and a few others.
I don't know,
Canadians.
I don't know why, but I'm going to stick to it.
It sounds better.
I'm so happy to have you here on State of a Nation because I've been trying to get you on for a long time. And I'll tell you, you're a fan favorite. We've had many requests to have you here in the studio. And so I want to pick your brains about what Israel has been doing wrong in explaining itself, what it's been doing right as well, and maybe where we diverge from a question of information to policy as well. How Israel's strategy has been unfolding in this war, how that strategy needs to change as the situation changes. I want to pick your brains as someone who was for many months one of the faces of the IDF representing Israel in international media with a long military background before that, now as a research fellow. And you've had a bit of a change of role since leaving the IDF spokesperson's unit during this war. You're still giving interviews on television around the world of making the case for Israel, but not in an official capacity. And I'm wondering, how has that transition been like for you? That you're no longer an official voice, but you're still representing an Israeli position.
Yeah, so let's start with that. I mean, lots to unpack. Israeli strategy, information warfare, and public diplomacy. Those are really important topics. And then we'll start with myself. It feels as if, you know, I believe that I fight for my people and I fight for my country without being in an official position. Nobody nominated me, nobody asked me to, and nobody's paying me anything to do it. I just feel that it is very much needed. It is needed for anybody that has any type of a voice or creative capability to speak up, tell their story, and to help the country fight in a very, very important battle. And the battle for the narrative is extremely important. I know that you are all too aware of it, and so are many of our viewers. But it doesn't appear to me, unless I'm missing something major here, as if the country really is aware of how important this battle is. And if it is aware, it has a very odd way of showing that awareness. I am, to be frank, I'm frustrated by the way that we've been fighting. I have nothing but respect for the men and women fighting on the ground. I think that the IDF, they're doing a tremendous job since the failure of October the 7th. What we've seen onwards has been tremendous fighting over many months. We've passed the 9-month mark. And I think that Israeli troops are beating the enemies wherever there's a tactical engagement on the battlefield. Israel is defeating hard, cruel, and very well-defended enemies. And however you take stock of the fighting in Gaza or in Lebanon, I think that at the tactical level, and I'll distinguish between tactical and then strategic, at the tactical level, the men and women fighting are doing a tremendous job, fighting on 7 fronts simultaneously, different dimensions, against a multitude of threats, and by and large, doing a tremendous job. What is different is how the state of Israel, from a strategic point of view, is managing its affairs and what the real strategic plan is. And as of now, and this may be to a lack of my understanding or lack of awareness of plans, for a simple civilian, it doesn't seem as if there is a coherent plan to address the multitude of challenges that Israel faces now, real time, and also around the corner, and the big strategic picture. And a lot of that goes to Iran. And I think that we have to be honest and say that what Israel has been doing for the last, I would say, 15, 20 years, vis-a-vis Iran, nuclear, as well as Iran's regional projects of basically producing and funding and arming terror organizations in the Middle East, our strategy isn't doing us any favors. It's basically allowing Iran to continue both of its main strategic projects. One, the nuclear, which according to all reports and assessments, they are just inching their way or striding ever so close to having nuclear military capabilities, both in terms of fissile material and also in terms of the technology needed to fire a missile and actually to deliver. We don't know how long it will take them to actually make a bomb, but we know that they have enough fissile material to make one. And that's been going on for decades. Statements have been made, fancy placards have been shown at the UN, and harsh words have been spoken. But in terms of action, action on the ground is on the Iranian side, and they are advancing towards nuclear capabilities. And our strategy so far hasn't stopped Iran from achieving that. And that's one part. But I'll speak less about nuclear Iran, and I'll speak more about the ring of fire that Iran has built around Israel. Now, if we take stock of their strategy, which basically says, we, Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, want to keep Israel in a perpetual state of fighting. We want to defeat it by ways of attrition, and we want to cause Muslims around the world to rise up and to kill the Jews and to basically annihilate Israel. That's the general plan of the Islamic Republic. And the way of executing that is by building different terror proxies, different proxy organizations around Israel. Some of them 2,000 kilometers away, like the Houthis. Some of them right at our borders, like the Islamic Jihad and Hamas in Gaza. And of course, the pinnacle of Iranian achievements in the Middle East, Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're currently busy with building other proxy organizations in Jordan, southwestern Syria, and as we are speaking, they are smuggling advanced weaponry to northern Samaria in order to have additional terror infrastructure in northern Samaria to target Israelis, military and civilians, and to unsettle that area of Israel as well. And we can see a dramatic incline in the amount of terror activity in that area, all of it related to the fact that Iran is executing its strategy. Now, when you look at the Israeli strategy, and we'll speak, I think, a lot about strategy in this conversation, because that, I think, that is really where Israel is faltering. We're not faltering on the tactical level and dealing with enemies once we're in combat.
By all accounts, the tactical achievements have been extraordinary, impressive.
They have. By any way that you compare Israeli troops after the failure, the tremendous failure of October the 7th, if we, for a second, even though it's a difficult intellectual endeavor to try to put that in parentheses, but if we do that and we look at October 7th and onwards, then yes, by all accounts, and in comparison to other militaries who fought in similar, not as difficult conditions, but in similar conditions, I think that the IDF and the other security organizations, Shabak and police mostly, but IDF and ISA, have been doing a tremendous job in really dismantling Hamas. But at the strategic level, I don't see where these efforts connect. And when we look at the main destabilizing factor of the Middle East, our main enemy, the sender, provider, and controller of all of the enemies around us, Iran, so far, they are getting away with impunity. They're attacking us. They are bleeding us day by day. They are targeting Israelis and Jews in Israel and Jews around the world. They are providing weapons, and they are inciting, and they are providing the political guidance and the directives for so many jihadists around the world, and nothing happens to them.
You've gone straight for the jugular, and this is really what I want to talk about in this episode, where Israel's strategy is failing in the information war, in the physical war. Both of them are connected. And I want to try to address these two topics separately because we have a lot to unpack. I want to start with the information war. You were the IDF's international spokesperson. You came back in emergency reserves on October 7th, and really tremendously impressive. I think you and Peter together managed to do more interviews in a single day than we on the civilian side were able to do in a week. Take me a little bit behind the scenes in terms of the strategic messaging in the IDF spokesperson's unit. You're going on TV. How do you know what to say? Who decides the message? Who's briefing you? And where are you getting your information from?
So, contrary to what I've heard about other parts of official Israel, where I've never been, I never had any assignments there, but in the IDF, there's a relatively structured process of getting information from the battlefield, vetting the information, and making sure that the numbers, the data, the answers, and the content that we are bringing from the field is verified, true, and as correct as it can possibly be in real time. So there's a system that filters up information, verifies it, and then gives it to the different spokespeople. You spoke about Peter. There were other English-speaking spokespeople, and then we have Aryeh, who speaks in German. We have Anna, speaks in Russian. We have Roni in Spanish, and we have a few other English.
Avichai speaking in Arabic.
Of course, Avichai is in a league of his own. He is really, I think, in a different dimension as a spokesperson, and his effect on the battlefield, his effect on the state of Israel, I think, is incomparable. It's like no one.
You'll all get medals. He might get two.
Yeah, he's. I think that is, something that books are being written about him, and I think they should be, because his ability to influence events by his persona, his command of the Arab language, and his long-standing gravitas as an Israeli spokesperson. He speaks for the military, but for, I would say, hundreds of millions of Muslims and Arab speakers around the world, he is the face of Israel. But we'll set Avichai aside. There's also Persian language and, of course, social media and everything. So the system, it works that first information filters up. And then there's a mix of what are the national messages and talking points and things that the state of Israel wants to emphasize. That gets filtered in through top down, basically from the Prime Minister's office, the Public Diplomacy Directorate, and then down through the Ministry of Defense, and eventually gets to the IDF spokesperson unit.
It's interesting you say that you feel you were getting it down through the Prime Minister's office via the National Public Diplomacy Directorate to the IDF, because when I was being interviewed, I knew what to say based on what you were saying in interviews, and I was getting briefed by your interviews.
as was I when I was looking at you and Mark and others, and of course.
But I was repeating yourself back at you.
Yes, well, you know, I remember we critiqued each other as well. I remember you sent me a few pointers, which I very much appreciated, and we exchanged points of view. But yes, you know, the back office of it was that the general messages. I'll give you an example. Early days, the first and second day, I thought that we were going to be speaking a lot about Iran. My first tweet at the end of the 7th of October, before I was in uniform, was, remember how this started? It started with an unprovoked attack by an Iranian proxy organization against Israeli civilians.
You know, let me just share a quick, and just a thought that I had in my mind yesterday. I was visiting Faraza and Be'eri. I remember seeing the media reports years ago about the threat of the Hamas tunnels into Israel, and the fears that Hamas might use these tunnels to commit a massacre in a kibbutz.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, no, they wouldn't do that, because then it would be so obvious that they're the bad guys if they just went into a kibbutz and committed a massacre of civilians. And everyone would know how this conflict started. And yet so quickly people forgot that it started by Hamas showing the world how it was the bad guys.
Yeah.
People forgot how it began. But you're saying here, remember how it began, not only with Hamas being the bad guys, but
what
as an
did.
Iranian proxy army.
Yes, and I mean, we know that because we know how conflicts in the Middle East start, and then we know how they usually evolve and eventually end. They start by Israel being attacked, and then Israel retaliates, creating a lot of devastation and casualties on the other side, mostly of combatants, but also of others. Then the visuals aren't appealing. Israel gets the blame, eventually is forced to stop fighting at some stage, and then the circle repeats itself. And that's why I wrote a tweet on the night of the 7th of October, as we were beginning only to little bit understand the size, the dimensions of the catastrophe that had befallen us. I assessed where this was going. We were going to go to war, and then we would be criticized for doing what we were going to do against Hamas in Gaza. And that's why I wrote, remember how they started. Now, going back to messaging, I anticipated that we would be talking about Iran. So in my first interviews, before everything was really organized, and you know, it was very chaotic first days in the State of Israel and the IDF, we were scrambling. By the way, a good opportunity to shout out to Daniel Hagari, the first official representative of the State of Israel, who had the courage to stand in front of cameras, speak in Hebrew to the Israeli public and say, this is what's going on. We haven't yet gained control over southern Israel. We're fighting. There's massive casualties. This is the scope of the attack. We're on it. And to start, you know, giving answers, and the politicians, it took them hours and I think days before they answered questions. He started answering questions from day one, even though he was the representative of the organization that was responsible for the failure. So good credit to him. But I thought that we were going to be talking about Iran, that this was Iran's doing, that the funding, the weapons, the guidance, the ideas, the directives, this was Iran. And then I was told, no, we're not talking Iran. And I said, well, how come? Why aren't we talking Iran? This is Iran's doing. That's not the message. So from then on, I understood, okay, we're not talking Iran because we're probably not intending to do anything about it. And that's why we're not going to talk about Iran. And I, of course, at the personal level, thought that didn't make sense to me, but I don't make decisions. I speak about them. And as such, I aligned myself with the directives given and spoke less about Iran.
Directives are coming down from Rear Admiral Hagari?
Well, there's a system that works in the IDF spokesperson unit, and I think it works generally well, of strategic messages that are then they are adapted to the military level.
Who's deciding these messages?
There's the strategic part of the IDF spokesperson unit. There's a colonel, there's a strategic team. They sit there and they think of the correct messaging. And then you have, of course, different messages for different target audiences. When you and I speak on English language TV, our target audiences are decision makers and people of more importance in the West,
Are
in
you
Western
getting
capitals.
what I'm trying to understand? Are you getting a sheet every day that is telling you today you need to talk about this, 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 and here's how we want you to tackle these issues?
Yes, there were the national messages, but then there were also the events on the ground, and there were, of course, topics that we wanted to emphasize. The first few days, it was about plugging the border, regaining control of the south, right? And then it went on to preparing for maneuver into Gaza, for moving civilians, evacuating civilians out of Gaza City into the south. And there were topics based on the combat objectives of the IDF as the IDF was preparing to conduct activities. Of course, but the target audience one is it's an interesting thing from a professional point of view, because many times you have the IDF spokesperson unit is a massive unit around.
It's an empire.
It is a formidable, I think it's the biggest PR agency in Israel, had it not been in uniform.
Yes, it helps when you have free labor, doesn't it?
Yes, and very talented labor. Very talented, very highly motivated, very smart young soldiers and the officers who are there. But the main target audience is, of course, Israelis, Hebrew-speaking Israelis.
Right. How much of that empire is dedicated to the international audience?
I would say up until Hagari, well, there was actually two significant changes. Brigadier General in Reserves Manelis and then Hagari. I think these are the two officers who had a profound influence on what I think is a correct and very adequate shift or a new division of the pie of efforts and resources within Dover Tzahal that shifted more access, resources, and priorities towards the international.
Towards what you call Tevel.
Yes.
Which is a very clever name for an international media department, because it's the acronym of Tikshoret Beinlaumit, international media, but it also means world. Tevel means the world.
Yes, it also means that. So it's a good. You
can see they're sharp on messages and branding
occasionally, and they did, at the strategic level. Historically speaking, I would say that one of the biggest challenges and something that was a cause for frustration for me was that Dover Tzahal is think of it as a massive train, but it only rides essentially on one track or one rail, and that is the Israeli one. Parallel, Arabic and international, and what really makes it challenging is that many times the messaging is conflicting.
Give me an example of where you saw tension between the Israeli message and the international message, and that our message around the world is actually being blunted by the interests of speaking to the domestic audience.
Happens many times a day. And I'll give you the biggest strategic one. Let's talk about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I said early on in meetings in the IDF, when we had strategic brainstorming, etc., I said we have to have a humanitarian plan for the situation in Gaza. We have to have and present a plan that says, this is what we're doing. This is the big really strategic plan of now they are here. There's 1.1 million Palestinians in Gaza. We want them to move to where? To Moassi, to a interim camp in Egypt, or an interim camp in Israel, or in southern Gaza. Where are they supposed to go? Who is going to facilitate it? And the messaging in Israel to the Israeli public was, and I think it's very understandable, the Israeli public didn't want to hear anything about how Israel was taking care of Palestinian civilians. There was tremendous rage and an urge for revenge and to get going with defeating Hamas after the atrocities that they did on the 7th and 8th of October. So the conflicting messages here were, in Hebrew, it was all about getting ready to fight Hamas inside Gaza and to defeat Hamas and demolish, etc., etc. Those were the directives given from the cabinet, and that's what the IDF was busy doing. But then on the international level, there's really a necessity, and we saw that unfold afterwards, to have first and foremost, a real plan on the ground, but then a strategic communication plan about what are we going to do with the civilians in the battlefield. We're obviously not there in order to kill all the civilians, and we obviously understand that since we are a democratic country, and we're a country that is founded on values of humanity, we cherish human life, we respect human life, unlike our enemies, then we have a humanitarian plan. We intend for non-combatants to move away from the battlefield so that we can defeat the enemy, kill the enemy, wherever he is hiding. What I felt was missing...
And getting attacked by Hamas as they secure humanitarian corridors. I was just yesterday, when I was visiting the south, meeting soldiers, and I asked them, what do you want the world to know? And one guy told me that I was shot at while securing a humanitarian corridor for civilians to evacuate.
2 days ago, we had Israeli soldiers wounded, 3 Israeli soldiers wounded in the central part of the Gaza Strip from securing a humanitarian delivery by RPGs that were fired at the convoy. This was just a few days ago.
We don't get a shred of international credit for it.
No, nothing about it, because I mean, that doesn't make the cut of something that's interesting. That doesn't make the narrative cut of what Israel is doing. And
it's not interesting that Israeli soldiers who have either been conscripted or forced into reserves are getting injured trying to keep Palestinian civilians safe, trying to do exactly what the world is demanding that we do, and we're paying a horrific price for it.
It should be interesting. And more than that, they're doing things that Hamas, UN organizations, and other NGOs are failing to do.
Well, that's a tautology. They're all the same thing in Gaza.
In many aspects, they are. So in terms of messaging, you see the conflict here between, on one hand, Israeli public, and then the IDF spokesperson unit responding to that, not wanting to speak about humanitarian issues. And then on the international level, we definitely need one, because that is the language spoken.
Well, why are they hampering each other? Can you not talk about the humanitarian things in English and not in Hebrew? How are these clashing with each other?
They're clashing because today, unlike, 2 decades, 3, 4 decades ago, everyone reads and hears and sees everything. So gone are the days where you can, in my mind, distinguish and compartmentalize between different audiences, where you can say one thing in Hebrew, not thinking that international media will pick up on it, and where you can say one thing in English without the Israeli media pick up on it.
It's fascinating you said this, because from my own end, I experienced the same thing. I used to start every government press conference by reading the names of the soldiers who were killed in the preceding 24 hours. And at one point, Ophir Gendelman, the Prime Minister's Arabic language spokesman, came up to me, pulled me aside and said, Eylon, I need you to stop mentioning the names of the soldiers at the beginning. It's hurting us in the Arabic world. I said, what are you talking about? He says, towards the Arab world, we need to project strength
deterrence,
and invulnerability and deterrence. And you are going on TV and reading a list of 12 soldiers killed in the preceding day, and it's harming our deterrent in the Arab world. I said, I'm very sorry about that, but my interest within the international media is I need people to know that we are paying a horrific price for this war that we did not want, that we did not start, that we did not expect, that was forced on us, that we don't want this war, but we're having to do this because it's a matter of national survival. And there you have that clash between the messages, and you're telling me, did you find yourself deliberately suppressing certain messages for an international audience because they didn't fit the domestic narrative?
Of course. I mean, there were so many things related to humanitarian that we needed to say, needed to do.
Such as what?
Needed to get out. The early efforts done by, for instance, a good example of a strategic decision that was made somewhere before the Israeli ground invasion started. There was a meeting with UNRWA and other UN and non-UN NGOs by COGAT, the Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories, had a meeting where...
I'm a veteran of that.
Yes. And they what Israel wanted to do was to create a humanitarian zone. And they asked UNRWA to create such a humanitarian zone in the Moassi. UNRWA said no. That was, I think, a strategic crossroads where Israel decided to continue to work with UNRWA, not to shame and out UNRWA for their strategic decision to basically facilitate or aid in killing lots of civilians, non-combatants. That was the actual importance of their decision.
The UN agencies have blood on their hands by refusing to cooperate, evacuate civilians to safety, 100%.
Definitely, but the strategic Israeli decision, in hindsight, was a mistake. At that time, what I think that
Funny, because I made that argument, but I think I was really going rogue when I made that point. That UN officials have blood on their hands.
They have. And we should have early on said, listen, world, we should have had a press conference where we should have read the protocol of that meeting, where we should have said, before the Israeli ground invasion started, we should have said, we just met with UN officials. Present were UNRWA, UNICEF, World Health Organization, etc., etc., etc. We requested, out of our concern for civilian life and out of the sanctity of human life and the fact that we don't want to kill lots of non-combatants, we want to kill Hamas very badly, and we will, but we don't want to kill civilians and we don't want to inflict damage on them. Out of that respect, we ask these guys to help, to work together and to build a humanitarian zone, but they refused. That should have been our communication strategy from that day and onwards, and we should have hammered that message on and on and on.
The only case in which the United Nations is refusing to evacuate civilians to safety, and Israel is begging them to protect civilians, get them out of harm's way, and they're insisting on keeping these civilians in Hamas strongholds, in places where they can be used not only as human shields, but as human sacrifices.
Yes, and sadly, we didn't leverage that media opportunity. I think the strategic thought was, okay, we'll need them further down the road, so let's not burn the bridge with UNRWA and others.
I remember getting a slap on the wrist at the beginning of the war when I started attacking UNRWA and being told, don't go after UNRWA. We need them. They're helping us on the humanitarian issues. I said, but it's insane what they're doing. They said, don't attack UNRWA. Eventually, there was an open season that was declared, and I think was rather less proactive and strategic than people from outside think it is, that there's this great Israeli plot to bring down UNRWA. But you're saying Israel missed, for domestic reasons, a strategic opportunity to out the United Nations for trying to keep civilians in Hamas strongholds.
Definitely. And then when you look at how that narrative, the humanitarian narrative, has unfolded, it is, I think, the most potent dagger or sword that our enemies and protectors and Israel haters and BDS supporters and Iran fans and Hamas fan clubs around the world are using against Israel. Very hypocritically, they don't care for human life. They don't care about Palestinians. They don't care about, you know, people surviving.
Do you think the government should prioritize the international message and say, look, the domestic audience, maybe you don't like this, but on a national strategic level, we're going to have to pump out this message you don't like because that's what we need globally?
Definitely, because, you know, what's even worse is that we're doing it anyhow. Israel has been dragged kicking and screaming to do what we should have been doing from the beginning.
Namely?
Providing humanitarian aid, controlling or opening the borders, providing electricity, providing water, helping with the sewage, providing food, and providing the basic necessities.
Because at the beginning of the war, when Hamas took down, 9 out of 10 electricity lines leading into Gaza on the first day of the war, Israel's policy was to say, okay, we are now cutting ourselves off from Gaza. This is now no longer our responsibility, but was really forced into opening more crossings than existed before and more infrastructure
and hooking up the infrastructure again. And you know, it's a matter of how things get done. Now, there's not a lot of sympathy in my heart for the people in Gaza who aided and abetted Hamas in their atrocities.
No, I have even less sympathy.
It's not as if I really particularly, there's no warm place in my heart for them. And I think that the whole ecosystem in Gaza is an ecosystem of hatred, of anti-Semitism, of rabid anti-Semitism, and a system that is really perverted and corrupt on a moral level. It's a system where young are educated to hate, in general, are educated to hate, where they grow up with the most vile ideology shoved down their throats, and then that becomes their persona.
By a death cult, supported by the United Nations, which is horrific that I'm having to say this, but it is what it is.
By international taxpayers.
Yes, thank you, international taxpayers, for paying for UNRWA, which teaches this Hamas death cult in schools.
Yes, and as basically an assembly line of future terrorists, future jihadists, who there's this whole martyrdom death cult.
Right. The question is not how many UNRWA staff participated in the October 7th massacre, it's how many UNRWA graduates took part, because they were all products of the United Nations schooling system.
Indeed. And it's such a travesty that isn't, you know, that, speaking about strategy, that should have been a strategic aim of the State of Israel. Now, I think the State of Israel, is a miracle.
You say that should be the strategic aim of the State of Israel. I don't actually know what Israel's official policy is on UNRWA at the moment. Do we want to disband it? Do we not want to disband it? Has a decision been made on a national level? I mean, I'll take you back behind the scenes. I found myself After the news about the UNRWA staff who took part in the October 7th massacre, I put on a special briefing for the international media about UNRWA. I pulled an all-nighter to bring together all your press releases from the IDF, all the different revelations, and then found myself piecing together something the Prime Minister had said, with something the Foreign Minister had said, with something the Defense Minister had said, to try to work out what our official position was. Because it's not just a question of communication, it's a question of policy. And here's what I want to really understand from you, if we really cut to the chase, on the level of policy and how we direct our public messaging. Look, let's be blunt. Is Israel losing the information war?
I think we're losing because it's a very challenging environment and because we're not really trying to win it. Unlike on the battlefield, where we are fighting and defeating our enemies, in the information warfare, you can call it information, you can call it the public relations, public diplomacy, public affairs, let's call it information, okay? In that realm, we aren't even fighting. Had Israel decided to fight, then, and I was just about to say that, you know, Israel has a track record of moving mountains and doing the impossible, right? Israel has done that so many times. We're a country now, we're the only country within a radius of 2,000 kilometers that has no lack of water. We've gone from a country that...
Yes, and with the recent IDF airstrikes on Hodeidah port in Yemen, we're learning just how much of the Middle East falls within 2,000 kilometers.
We know. We do indeed. And 2,000 kilometers, that was 1,800. But we are the only country in a very big radius that doesn't today have any challenges with water, which isn't the Israel that my parents and people of that generation grew up in. I was educated still, you know, in an education system when I made Aliyah at the age of 13 of we have to conserve water. Why? Because there's not enough. Now we've gone from that to having an abundance of water, and we trade in water in order to advance our national security with Jordan and with Egypt, and we're able to grow whatever we want, wherever we want it, because we've through a strategic approach, through a national effort, we've transitioned from having no water and that being a liability to having water and it being an enabler.
We turn crises into opportunities.
Exactly. And that I speak about water because that's, I think, the most important example that you could make of how Israel, official Israel, government Israel, got it right from the beginning in a long process that probably wasn't perfect, but the end result is marvelous.
Let me take
water.
Let me take a step back because we've gone on a bit of a tangent talking about water. Why do you think that Israel is not even fighting?
Right, so I use water because that is the example of the government deciding to do something, allocating resources, budget, priorities, personnel, educating people, having the public sector and having civil society part of it. And then you get this accumulative effort of winning with public affairs, with information.
Do you think the information war can be won?
I think that we can do much, much better and that we can lose less and we can advance our strategic aims in a much, much better way. And, you know, we don't know yet at this stage how badly we're losing, and we don't know really the long-term consequences of our current situation from a legal perspective, from a trade perspective, from an educational perspective. These are things that we still don't know. We can just, you know, do an average assessment and to understand that it's not good.
Tell me then, what is the Conricus plan for winning the information war? If you were appointed the head of the National Public Diplomacy Directorate, by the way, they're looking for a head. Have you been interviewed for the role?
No, I haven't.
Would you like to be interviewed for the role?
Yeah, I don't know how good of a fit I would be. I think there's political issues that are, I think that in this current government, I am not sure how much competence is valued. And I think that there are other traits that are more important than competence and being actually fit for the job. And frankly, I don't think that anything substantial is going to happen in the imminent future. As much as we need it, as desperately as the state of Israel needs it, I don't see any significant change happening. But
well, let's suppose that you were put in charge of Israel's strategic messaging and given an unlimited budget. What do you put that war chest to use for?
I would do the following. I would model it by how Israel addressed the issue of water. Why? Because we do need it grassroots, and we do need things to grow from below, and we do need it to be part of our education system. I think that we, Israel as a state, as a country, we're such a small country, we are so influenced and exposed to our international relations, yet we don't invest in our international relations in such a way, that is comparable to the gain that we can make and also to our exposure to it. So I would start by first and foremost having it declared as a national enabler, and for then other government ministries to address it as such. The education ministry needs to start educating Israelis about how important it is not to limtzo chen, to look good in the eyes of the world, but to be smart about what we want to achieve.
But what does this mean, as we say in Hebrew, tachlis? Debate club, investing in the humanities?
It's English. Okay, education-wise, it's English at a speaking level, not past progressive and tenses, but it's really having people being able to communicate in English. It is understanding cultures. It is understanding other ways of thinking. I think it's very important, separate from that, to teach Israelis how to speak Arabic really properly, but that doesn't serve the...
Without the past progressive.
Yes, exactly. But the point here being of having an understanding at a very basic level that it is important for us to interact in a positive way with the world, that it furthers
because many Israelis think there's no point even bothering.
Yes, there's no point. They're all anti-Semites.
Okay, so there's education. So we'll take them through debate club, teach them history, open Israeli society up to the world, media literacy,
as well as universities.
Okay, that's a 25-year project. Talk to me now.
Indeed. And then we speak about having budgets and paying for the best, brightest, young or old, but talented people with a track record and willingness and with a burning desire to do so, to advance the state of Israel, advance our public interest. I would focus on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There's a tremendous, in my mind, revision needed.
Away from the defense establishment towards diplomacy.
Yes. To focus.
I mean, you see that reflected just in the salaries, the really risible salaries that people are paid in the foreign ministry, compared to the defense ministry, where actually they're paid quite well.
Many are indeed, and I think that if someone were to write a book of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs 50 years ago and today, its position in Israeli society and in comparison to other ministries, the amount of embassies that we have. Do you know that we are actually, instead of building new embassies and consulates around the world, we are diminishing? And you know that the Palestinians have more diplomatic missions around the world than we have, and they're not even a state.
Complete own goal. So we need to invest in the foreign service. We need to pay our diplomats better. We need to recruit better.
We need to have the best people.
But if I'm putting you, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, in reserves, in charge of Israel's strategic messaging, what are we doing apart from strengthening the foreign service and teaching Israeli kids debate club?
Right. Well, not debate club, but we do.
I think we need debate club.
Oh, that too.
Because people want to know, how do you speak for Israel? I think, first of all, you need to learn how to think critically. You need to learn how to argue. You need to think on your feet. And that's what debate club teaches you.
You need to watch what others are doing. You need to watch debates in English. You need to see how it's done.
Okay, but right now, because this war isn't going away anytime soon.
Right now we're in crisis mode. Right now, there should be...
Well, as you say, Iran is going to keep us in permanent crisis mode, unfortunately. That's the new normal.
Yeah, until we deal with it on a military level. But what we should be doing now, what I was talking about was, long term. But if we speak about it now, then it's immediately manning all battle stations with the best and brightest Israelis who are here, who can and have the intellectual and cultural understanding of how to get messages out to the world. Having them given the best equipment and the best technological support system. We should have, I'd say, hundreds of fact checkers and open source analysts who would be able to provide the fast response, first to identify a brewing media crisis, then to analyze it quickly, and then to provide answers in a very short, media relevant time frame, not in a military time frame or a government time frame, which simply takes too long from a media perspective, but really to have fact checkers.
None of this exists right now?
No, it doesn't exist, and we need...
Not outside the army, at least.
In the army, there's no real unit or group of people who actually do fact-checking for media purposes. In the IDF, I would totally reroute intel and the sources of information to such a level that I would have a dedicated part, let's say 2, 3, or 5% of Israeli intel, not on a nice-to-have basis, but working for Israeli public affairs. As in, their job isn't to create intelligence so that we can put bombs where bad guys are, which is what most of Israeli intelligence does, but it is actually to collect high-quality visuals and other types of intel to serve the purposes of Israel's public campaign against its enemies. Good examples are UNRWA, with one little dossier of information based on IDF military intel about the participants of the October 7th massacre, UNRWA members, and how many UNRWA members are also members of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. That went a very long way.
You say it went a long way, but there's still a narrative on the other side that says Israel never presented any evidence.
Because we stopped short of actually following through. We started with the punch, but we didn't really deliver it. And if we delivered one punch, we didn't deliver the follow-up, so the other guy is still standing. But you saw that it had effect. Israel came up with intel, hardcore intel, with names, with ID cards, and proof of horrible wrongdoing and corruption and malpractice at UNRWA, and that had an effect. They fell short on their funding. Organizations and countries around the world stopped funding UNRWA because it was exposed for what it is. But then Israel stopped, and we are not pursuing this anymore. So the whole issue of...
Such a missed opportunity.
Terrible. And it will be, I think...
I mean, to declare battle without the necessary...
Without the strategic
weapons
plan,
is one thing. No, but to declare a battle and then essentially withdraw from it.
Yes, and leave it open, because then you send the mixed message of, well, we started something, but we're not following through. Then was it legitimate to begin with? And then the other side can say, well, we were unfairly judged.
And that's definitely an own goal that we've scored.
So what I would do intel-wise, and this is, now really urgently speaking, is to reroute and reprioritize IDF intel. I would prioritize getting the level of hurts me to say it, but Hezbollah level combat camera and visuals from the battlefield, and have us at the same level. On all other accounts, we're much stronger and better than what Hezbollah is, but in terms of getting combat footage out, Hezbollah is much better, and in the first days of the fighting, Hamas did a better job than we did. I hate to admit it.
No, we mustn't underestimate our enemies. They're tremendously impressive.
So I would focus on telling, and this would be in a hierarchical way. IDF intel would have to allocate Air Force platforms, drones, and fixed-wing planes and helicopters. And IDF intel, signals intelligence, visual intelligence, spatial intelligence, satellites, etc., would focus on giving the whole system the basis of, the basic ammo.
Why is this not happening now?
Priorities.
Whose priorities?
Government, military. As I mentioned before, there were times in recent history where IDF spokespersons, General Manelis and currently Hagari, based on their personal understanding of how important it was for Israel to engage better around the world, they actually rerouted and reprioritized, but it's not been done yet on a strategic and, let's say, formal level. And in terms of intel, it's still on a very rudimentary, if there's an opportunity level, and it's not top down, 2%, 3% of Israeli UAVs, this is what you do. Night and day, you find us how Hamas is using civilians as human shields. You show the world how they're firing rockets from within populated areas. You show the world how they are abusing their own and how they are stealing humanitarian aid.
But Jonathan, let me push back, because I feel that even when Israel has coughed up evidence of Hamas misconduct and shown, and you took soldiers in yourself, you took foreign media in yourself to show them how they were embedded in hospitals and in civilian areas, even when Israel coughs up the visual evidence to back up its strategic messages, no one cares.
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say that no one cares. I would say that it's definitely an uphill struggle. We do not get any free lunches, unlike our enemies who are handed free lunches on a silver platter.
With a silver spoon shoving it down their throat, those free lunches.
Every day, those free lunches are given by willing journalists and editors around the world who are, basically what they're doing is just prolonging the suffering. And instead of helping those that they are allegedly helping, the Palestinians, they're just prolonging their suffering, and they're making a fight or a battle that could have been done and dusted months ago continue to fight because they're fueling their narrative.
So if I can summarize the Conricus plan, essentially investing the proper resources in determining the strategic messages and then reallocating intelligence resources towards finding the evidence to support those strategic messages and sticking to them.
And prioritizing international media over Israeli, and having the best and brightest paid in order to do that job, having open source and spatial intelligence people, spatial as in space and territory, not special, to analyze quickly, to have fact checkers, and to have a unit or an entity that is well funded, resourced, and has the authority to override others. And also very important, discipline with ministers and members of Knesset, for them to actually have to seek approval before they speak on matters of national security.
How much damage did that do to you?
I think it's been very challenging at times to try to explain or to circumvent or navigate around statements that have been made by elected officials. And I address elected officials in Israel, even though many of them, they don't carry themselves with a lot of respect. I address people with respect because they are elected officials. So even if I didn't elect them, even if I didn't elect them, and if they are not to my taste, that doesn't matter. They're elected officials. But
when government ministers went off message, essentially promoting their own policy agendas that were not reflected in government policy,
at the expense of the state of Israel,
how much damage did that do?
I think strategic damage, and I can think of a lot of tweets and quotes.
Can you give me an example?
Early on statements that were made by, for instance, the current Minister of Foreign Affairs, Katz, about what the fate of Gaza would be and what will come into Gaza and what won't come into Gaza. In the moment, perhaps there were, gut feelings that perhaps
people were angry.
I was angry. I was furious.
We were livid.
Of course.
We were livid.
I was livid. I was beyond. I mean, I've never been so angry and frustrated and ashamed and furious in my life.
It was a whole whirlwind of emotions.
Yes, but that doesn't allow you to do mistakes. Even when you are in such a horrible situation, you cannot make mistakes that will come back and bite you a few months down the road. And that is what many did, to speak about, again, the humanitarian, that nothing will go in, etc. That's not very useful. And other statements that, in hindsight, didn't do good for the state of Israel.
So from your overall analysis in the information war, Israel has essentially not only been fighting with two hands tied behind its back, but with those hands essentially amputated, and not having the resources it needs, or even understanding the importance of the information war to buying time and being able to achieve those goals. And those goals, I want to pivot away from the information war right now. This is not just a war between Israel and a terrorist organization in Gaza. It is a war in which, if there's one thing I want people to remember from the messages that we're pumping out at the citizen spokesperson's office, Israel is fighting for its life against the Iranian regime and its proxy armies on 7 fronts: Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Iran itself. I would add an 8th front, the diaspora, and attacks on Israeli and Jewish targets around the world. Tell me...
And a brewing front is also Jordan.
Jordan, Iran is trying to rope in the Taliban as well. We have no shortage, as they say in Yiddish, of tzoros, of trouble here. How do you understand Israel's policy towards what we often call the head of the snake,
Right.
the Iranian regime. And how do you think that Israel needs to reorient its strategy towards Iran to get out of this permanent crisis mode that Iran is trying to keep us in?
I'm a senior fellow at an American think tank called FDD, Foundation for Defense of Democracies. They've been around for more than 20 years and almost 25 now. And they've been very, very consistent when it comes to Iran, the Iranian regime, and what the free world, led by the US, but with others as well, needs to be doing to counter Iran's malign activities in the world and in the region. And they've said this for years, that there's a need for a much stronger strategy against Iran. And currently what FDD is doing is actually looking at ways of helping elected officials around the world to cross the mental or intellectual, but let's say mental Rubicon of actually bringing about regime change in Iran. Regime change in Iran is, I think, the potentially most influential thing that can happen in the Middle East, the most positive thing that can happen in the Middle East, that if and when it happens, and it's, I think, a question of when it happens, eventually this terrorist, oppressive, cruel regime will fall, either by external or internal, or by a mix of both.
You really believe that?
Yes, I believe so. I believe that their days are counted. But what I also believe is that the powers around the world, and Israel one of them, that have the ability to speed up that process and to make that horrible entity, that oppressive, cruel, brutal regime, the Islamic Republic regime, to make its days more difficult and challenging, and to have them focus more of their resources on defending themselves than on projecting power in the Middle East. We're not doing that.
Are you saying Israel should be proactively seeking to engineer regime change in Iran?
I think that Israel should do what it can within its capabilities. And Israel is a small country with, as we just discussed, a very long list of tasks and challenges that we face against Israeli civilians, against our very sovereignty. What Israel needs to do is to allocate, first and foremost, to formulate a strategic plan to counter Iran's strategy. Their strategy is to have a ring of fire around us and to bleed us into attrition. Our strategy should be to counter that and to play offense instead of defense. It should be to undermine their ability to execute their strategy.
How do we do that?
First and foremost, we have to start putting a price on Iranian aggression. Up until now, there hasn't been one. If you ask an Israeli intel officer or Mossad analyst, and you ask them, the Revolutionary Guard, the semi-government entity of the Islamic regime that is tasked with all the expeditionary tasks, that basically sets Iranian foreign policy. How much of their resources do you think that they spend on defending the regime versus expeditionary missions in terms of building proxies around the Middle East and destabilizing?
Right, it's a Praetorian Guard that's also exporting the revolution at the same time.
That's their mission statement, right? That's what they do. They defend the
Praetorian Guard and Imperial Army.
Exactly. Both of these two things, and they are off the books. They have their separate chain of command. They answer only to the supreme leader. They have almost unlimited resources and funding within the Iranian system. They get access to the best and most ideological personnel, and they have the best equipment in Iran. Not the best equipment in the world, but they get the best of the best that Iran has to offer. So this organization, how busy is it being a Praetorian Guard and making sure that Iranians don't rise up against the oppressive rule of the religious fanatics that have been governing Iran since 1979? And how much time do they have as an imperial army? In my mind, they have far too much time and leisure to make our lives horrible and challenging, and they are not forced to spend a lot of efforts on defending and being a Praetorian Guard. And I think that...
How do you put a spoke in that wheel then?
Many ways of making Iranians hurt. And I think that the Israeli strike in Hodeidah...
We're talking about the regime.
Yeah.
Not the people.
No. let me say something frank. You can't bring down a regime without there being an effect on the people. You can't bring down Hamas without Palestinians suffering and revolting against Hamas. You cannot bring down the Iranian regime without the Iranian people doing it. I don't think that there's any historical precedence of that ever happening, of an autocratic totalitarian regime that fell down and people were happy before.
So you're saying essentially Israel needs to make the Iranian regime spend time licking its wounds, so it's too busy to lash out against
and
Israel.
limit its ability to generate foreign money, limit its ability or limit its access to money that it uses in order to fund terrorists. And I think that the attack on Hodeidah was a very good example, and I was very happy to see it done by Israel. And I was also very happy to hear defense ministers speak about all that the flames of Hodeidah can be seen all around the Middle East.
An excellent line.
Which is a very, very good line. And I think that's really important. And I think that...
it's tragic we had to get to this position, but
yeah, and
they sent a suicide drone and murdered one of my neighbors in Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
So it's a damn good thing we struck back.
Well, we should have done it months ago, perhaps, but I think that
9 months of restraint.
But there was wisdom here, and I think that strategically speaking...
By letting the Americans shoot down the...
Yes, and it not immediately becoming an Israeli issue, and Israel waited, Israel was strategic, it was patient, it didn't lash out and respond immediately, it wasn't a chest-thumping kind of a moment.
9 months of over 200 missiles and drones.
Yes, a horrible amount, but when finally we did something, we did much more than what Americans and British have been doing for months and what the Saudis did for years of a campaign. And I think that's very important. But the line I want to draw here is between Hodeidah and Bandar Abbas. Bandar Abbas is the main port of exit from Iran. That is where they export oil. That is where they export petrochemical products. That is what finances most of Iran's abilities to run its proxy empire. That is how they finance the regime.
And you think that Israel should cripple the Bandar Abbas port?
I think that Israel needs to start putting a price tag, and I won't get more specific, but I gave one example, but there are many, many other examples that I don't think it would be wise to say here out
Certainly
in the open.
not. We know that the Ayatollahs are watching. They're big fans on YouTube.
Lovely. But I think that Israel needs to be putting a price tag on the Iranian regime for its acts of aggression against Israel. So far, we aren't. The Mossad has done, reportedly, some quite creative and successful things, taking out generals and taking out scientists and doing all kinds of things against... Allegedly.
According to foreign media reports.
Etc., against the Iranian nuclear program. But we haven't yet really put a price tag. And I think that Israel has the capabilities. And bottom line, everything said and done, if we don't change our strategy, I don't think that there's any incentive for the Iranian regime to change its strategy.
Why do you think that hasn't happened? Why, despite the many years of the Netanyahu government, and Netanyahu has made standing up to Iran the centerpiece of his premiership, why do you think the approach has been too timid in your analysis?
I don't know. It's a very good question, because the disparity between statements, bluster, and rhetoric, and actions, tachlis actions, and if you do a score between Iran and Israel strategically today, the Iranian strategy is working very well for them. So I cannot come up with...
Could it be a fear of provoking an all-out devastating war with Iran that would see us attacked on 7 fronts simultaneously?
Obviously,
Iran, something we want to avoid.
Obviously, Iran has built over the years a significant military belt around Israel with the ability to threaten the lives of Israelis. And obviously, Israeli strategy has been how to try to minimize the effect of those proxies against Israel and doing things that are short of war. What I think that we have to come to terms with and be clear about in Israel is that we need to change our strategy, that the strategy that guided us, if there was such a strategy that guided us so far, isn't doing us a lot of favors, and that we need to change it. And I think that there needs to be a comprehensive one, where making it hurt is one part of it, but there needs to be an information campaign of it, there needs to be a diplomatic campaign, there needs to be a financial part of the whole strategy, and obviously goes without saying, it needs to be coordinated and harmonized with other free democracies who have the same interest of stopping Iran's malign influence in the region and in the world. First and foremost,
and
the
that's
US.
another important strategic message, that this isn't just a war between Israel and a Palestinian terror group. This is Israel fighting a proxy army of an aggressive Iranian imperial project. Jonathan, you, throughout the war, conducted how many interviews?
400 or 500.
400 or 500 interviews.
Yeah.
I want to help some of our viewers understand the man behind the uniform and understand who you are and where you come from as a person. You are, in fact, a Swedish Israeli, correct?
Yes.
Your father was Swedish?
Yes, my father is Swedish, mother is Israeli.
House full of IKEA furniture, I'm imagining then.
Yeah.
Much like this studio. Okay, so listen, I want to play a game with you. And that game is called ABBA or ABBA. And I want to find out how Swedish you are, how Israeli you are. So I'm going to ask you some quick, rapid-fire questions and I want to get your answers, okay?
Right.
Swedish meatballs or falafel?
Falafel.
Swedish crayfish party or Israeli Shabbat dinner?
Probably Shabbat dinner.
What is a Swedish crayfish party?
It's they do it usually in the autumn. It's
Okay.
Where people get together, usually on the neighbor basis, not necessarily families, but people who live close by, and they eat shellfish that they harvest locally. They drink a lot. Usually Swedish occasions are an excuse for drinking.
Just like Shabbat dinners.
It is, yeah, you know, and if the Jewish thing is, you know, we had enemies, they were cruel, they fought us, they tried to kill us, let's eat. So in Sweden, it's getting together, having lots of good Swedish food and alcohol and having a good time. Many times Swedes need some alcohol in order to loosen up and feel more comfortable. And a crayfish festival, I think it's in September, is usually that as well.
Okay, no fins and no scales. Crayfish are a big no-no.
Yeah.
Swedish sauna or Dead Sea spa treatments?
Oh, good one. I'd probably go for a sauna.
Swedish sauna. Okay.
Yeah.
Snow sports or beach sports?
Beach.
Beach. Matgot?
Yeah, well, yeah.
And of the great Eurovision winners, ABBA or Netta?
Netta.
Netta, there we go. Healthcare in Sweden or healthcare in Israel?
I'd say, well, I haven't really experienced it in Sweden, but I would say Israel.
Israel, okay. Israel seems to be winning so far.
Yeah.
Do you prefer the Swedish emphasis on sustainability and corporate social responsibility or the Israeli focus on innovation and its startup culture?
That's a good question because you pick two real topics where both countries are real global leaders. I think there is a lot to learn from, you know, you go to Stockholm today, a modern city of, I think there are around 3 million people. You can actually swim in the center of the city. It's a city of, I think it's 14 islands, and you can take your clothes off and you can jump in the sea in the middle of the city of Stockholm. A modern, bustling metropolitan city. The water's clean enough. They eat the fish that they catch in that area. That is how clean the water is.
You're saying you jump into the water in Stockholm and grab a fish and take it home for lunch?
Yes, you can fish outside your house. That is how clean the water is. That is how sustainable Swedish development is. And I think there's a lot to learn from it. And it goes, by the way, the same way that I spoke about Israeli water, etc., through education, through legislation, high tech and development and government policies. And then you have amazing results where this, you know, Sweden is one of, by the way, Sweden and Israel are one of very few countries in the world that actually have a positive rate of planting versus cutting down trees. Sweden has a lumber industry that Israel doesn't, but Israel plants trees, unlike all of our neighbors, and so does Sweden. And that's a good emphasis on sustainability.
So who gets the win on this question?
You know what? Just to even the score, I'll do the Swedish
We'll
side.
give it to Sweden.
Yes,
okay.
even though, I mean, much praise for what Israel is doing.
Sweden's approach to gender equality or Israel's efforts towards cultural diversity?
Also a good one. In Sweden, they have almost half of the elected officials are women. Very high representation of women in the C-suite roles. They're probably benefiting a lot from that in terms of human potential and capital. But I would go with Israel because I think that the challenges here in Israel are are bigger and more diverse. And I think that we have gone a long, long way in terms of including people and bridging gaps that perhaps my parents' and grandparents' generation thought would never be bridged.
Speaking of those challenges, Sweden's policies on immigration and integration, or Israel's law of return and great melting pot culture?
So if anything, I think is a strategic failure to Sweden, in Sweden and with Swedish policy, mostly under the Social Democrats, it is massive immigration, uncontrolled, unconditioned immigration of people who imported into Sweden mindsets that in many cases are medieval, jihadi, primitive, and yes, I say primitive in a judgmental way and a condescending way, and I mean it. Primitive, horrible, dark mindsets of oppression, of violence, of brutality that they imported into a society that is all but the opposite of it, and with no indication and no willingness to change. And where the Swedish state didn't say, if you want to come to this quite successful country that we have built here that has everything, you're cared from the cradle to the grave, you're cared for by the Swedish system, but they're not asking them to adopt democratic values and to say, yes, we respect others, we respect diversity, human rights, rule of law, the basic tenets of democratic society. There's no pledge of allegiance in Sweden. They don't have to, immigrants don't have to pledge allegiance to the Swedish state. There's no real constitution, but the flag or the institutions. It's just come and enjoy the system.
And just that assumption that if you bring people from around the world, everyone will ultimately blend into universal values. We actually had a fascinating discussion here on the podcast with Luai Ahmed, who claimed refuge in Sweden from the Houthis in Yemen because he's gay, and spoke about how Sweden is in deep, deep denial about the levels of extremism that they're importing. So I'm giving a point to Israel on that one. Swedish conscription model or Israel's mandatory military service?
No doubt, Israel.
What is Sweden's conscription model?
Now they've gone back. They used to be one of the few countries in Europe that had a conscription military, but it was, as you know, it was conscription in the same Israelblof way as Israel was, as in, if you want to serve, you can serve, but if you don't want to serve, you just make up some half-baked reason and you don't serve. So what you basically had was lots of blonde-eyed Swedes who were ideologically inclined to serve and to protect their country and who wanted to do so, and then lots of people who didn't serve. Then they abolished the mandatory service. It became a small so-called professional army. And now, since Ukraine, they've gone back to mandatory service. The numbers and the willingness to serve and protect has gone up. Sweden has joined NATO. But at the end of the day, if there's a real threat to Swedish territorial integrity, I'm not sure that they have a military to protect them, except despite for having a very good defense industry and probably capable units, but as a military, many, many years of underfunding, underspending.
And Israel is definitely ahead in that regard. Sweden's love affair with global international institutions or Israel's commitment to national security and counterterror?
So the person who did research here has done a good job, because you're really hitting things on the nail. I think that from a utopian point of view, Sweden, I think, had, they have this idealistic thinking, this utopian thinking of let's invest everything in international organizations, the UN, and all of the ecosystem of NGOs, and they will help make the world a better place. They will diminish poverty, diminish suffering, and help those in need. And those who have more, countries that are richer and more affluent, will contribute money and sometimes...
so I'm giving the point to Sweden here.
No.
No, why not?
Because it's not working. Sadly, it's not working. And I think that as an Israeli, when I look at how horribly international organizations have failed in their charters, their missions, and their basic debt to decency, when it comes to Israel, I think it is abysmal. And it's not Sweden's direct doing, although in some cases it is. But in general, I think we're looking at a failing system. I served at the UN. I was the first Israeli officer who served at UN headquarters on behalf of the State of Israel. I served in UN peacekeeping. I got
The UN headquarters where?
in New York. We lived there for 3 years. I was sent on behalf of Israel to the Office of Military Affairs in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. Now they changed the names. It's
Congratulations on maintaining your sanity.
Yes, it was 3 very, very interesting years. But when I look at the system now, as an Israeli, I look at how that whole ecosystem, what the return on investment that it's giving, it's a horrible failure. In Gaza, it's a horrible failure. For Palestinians, it's an abysmal failure because it has indulged a dream or a nightmare or a dream of something that's never going to happen. It has put them through misery and suffering instead of having them do what all minorities or losers have done, is to get on with it and build a life and understand that what you want...
Because they keep them in permanent refugee status until such a point that they can violently destroy the State of Israel.
And they fuel the notion and the idea of this, that this one day this will happen, that one day you will return to Haifa and to Tel Aviv. And they keep people in this perpetual mental state of longing for something that they're never going to see. And this is fueled by an international system that aids and abets it.
So
sadly.
I'm giving that point to Israel then. And we have 9 for Israel, 2 for Sweden. And with your final answer, you've just given away the answer to the bonus question, which is whether you prefer Sweden's approach to funding UNRWA and teaching, giving money to the indoctrination of Palestinian children in schools and paying the salaries of October 7th terrorists, and to a UN organization that allows Hamas to operate out of its schools, or to the Israeli strategy of exposing all that. And it seems you think that Israel's making...
If there is such one.
If there is such a strategy, which we discussed in this episode, unfortunately, despite some efforts to try to delegitimize UNRWA, not enough of a concerted strategy. Jonathan, this has been a fascinating discussion. How can viewers and listeners follow you and your work?
Through FDD. And for those who want hardcore strategic and military analysis of all of the enemies of democracy, fdd.org. I have my personal Twitter, my ex at Conricus. That's where I'm most active. Unlike you, not yet active on Insta, but I will be in the future.
We'll get you there.
Yes, we will get there. And it's been a pleasure. And I want to take the opportunity to commend you and your amazing team for what you're doing here. It is outstanding and inspiring to see what one man with very capable people and funding behind it can do and establish. And I think you should really get kol hakavod for what you're doing. It is tremendous.
Thank you. That means a lot to me, especially from one of my personal war heroes. At Conricus. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of State of a Nation with Lieutenant Colonel Reserves Jonathan Conricus. As always, if you enjoy these episodes, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever else you get your podcasts. Give us a like and follow on all the social media platforms. We'll be back soon with more episodes taking you beyond the headlines and between the lines. I'm Eylon Levy, and thanks for joining us.